So we are very thrilled to have filmmakers and Jan with us.
It's made for giants here. I'm so yeah, there's no what I can put under my.
Okay, maybe we can find another more suitable.
Okay.
In the meantime, it's very thrilling to have you here, Margarethe, because, well, of course, you admire Ingmar Bergman, and that's the subject of your film. But also the subject of the film is someone who has admired you and your work. And how about starting with the direction of the film? You co-directed it with Felix. Yes. And Mother and Son, if you don't know. And if you have seen the film yesterday, it's already, part of the film is about the father-son relationship. Ingmar Bergman's son, also a filmmaker. And you see the tension. And film is in a way a contemplation on the contrast between the life of the artist and the life of a father, a family man.
May I start in another way?
Please
because
go.
I want to have to thank him officially for his good advice, because I was so afraid to do the film, and my producer is here in the room, and she pushed me. She's half Swedish and half German, and she had the idea for the 100th birthday to produce a film and about Ingmar Bergman, and I was, no, please don't ask me, because it's too much for me. I can't do it. And then she insisted, and my son, who is a documentarist, he insisted, and he's always more confident. No, had more confidence with me than I have with myself. And my agent also, they pushed me. And then I went with Constanze to Sweden and to the foundation, Bergman Foundation. And I asked him, please tell me, what can you do? What can I do? There's so many things already said and done and written and filmed. And there's so much material. What can I add now to give something a new aspect or so? And then he said to me, please do it in a very personal way. You knew him, and you lived in Munich in the same moment where he came to Munich and did his theater plays there, and also 2 films. Do it as personal and as you can. And so that was the advice, and therefore I could do the film, really, because you gave me this. You remember? Yeah.
Yes. Of course I remember. Thank you so much. But it's
but you
really
have
your work.
to add something. Why did you say that to me?
Well, for those of you who have seen the film, I think the film speaks for itself. It had to be done, and you did it beautifully, so okay. I'm very glad you did.
Okay. So now I can answer for the...
You already answered 2 of my questions.
Okay. Yeah, because you pushed me to... Yeah.
No, it was not really a mother-son collaboration. I was very engaged in the beginning of the project, and maybe then in the end. I was not so present during the shooting, but I was present at the very important shooting with Daniel Bergman, and that was quite funny because, of course, Margarethe comes from directing feature films. It's her first documentary. Of course, she's a natural, and was. Adapt them very quickly to the genre of documentary. But she's, of course, used to tell the actors what to do. And that did not work, especially with Daniel Bergman. So one of you who saw the film yesterday, when we were preparing, Margarethe was saying, okay, then he'll come into the bibliothek, and then the camera is here, and then we have in the background the poster of Strindberg that will be look very good. And then Daniel Bergman came into the bibliothek and had absolutely no intention to stay there for very long. and said yes, 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 and then maybe you saw it in the film and immediately went out, and and you learn that it's not like you can tell them what to do, and it's a script, and they have to say that, and I need this.
Yeah, but he was used to it.
So I used it and say, wait, it's maybe it doesn't work out. But then there was this interview with Daniel was developing so strongly, and I think it's the center, one of the main centers of the film, and Daniel was very open, and this thing when he talked about his relationship with his father and the project he made, I had to make another reference because he said. I worked with Ingmar, and Ingmar told me, okay, I like the film you made, but this scene has to go out. There's just one scene I don't like, this scene has to go out. And I made a documentary this year with Margarethe as main protagonist. It's about the radical sympathizers of the radical left in Germany. And you are one of the main characters, and when I showed the film to Margarethe, she said, well, it's a great film, but there's one scene, and this one scene has to go out.
Margarethe, do you like this one?
That's all I have to say to the collaboration.
No, I'm bigger than you. Yeah.
So there are two very interesting scenes in the film. One is, I don't remember if it was before the encounter with Bergman's son or after, but there's a scene actually behind the scene of Fanny and Alexander in which Bergman hugs, like a beautiful uncle, like a father figure, hugs this boy actor. And he's so physically kind to him, unlike the way he behaves towards his son. Did you decide to put that after that interview, which might be, I can rephrase my question in a different way, that the film was shaped up while the interviews were being filmed, or you already had a structure for it?
No, the structure came in the cutting room,
right.
More or less, because I even didn't know what we can get as documentary material, and also what we can get from the scenes out of his films, because nowadays it becomes so expensive to get these
archive material,
footage.
License.
For instance, to tell you that for the Serpent's Egg, we wanted to have a real film material of the real film. Now we have only documentary scenes in it, but we wanted to have, and we already chose a scene which I was then talking with him behind the bars, and when he's running and he's trying to get out of the police station, and it's a very good scene, but that was the possession of this film was Americans, and they wanted for 1 minute $18,000. So you can imagine, when you do a documentary, you have not this much money so you have to choose also, not only because you would like to have some scenes, and you have some scenes in mind because you know all the films of him. You have to choose it also. When you get this scene, then you have to sacrifice another, because we have a certain budget. And we have to stay with. No. It's really a problem with this here.
Giant of cinema, but not in the chair.
You have to stay in a certain budget, and so that's for me also a little bit new. He knows it because he has always a little bit the same problems. But so to give the impression that it's really your film, and you want to say that what you say in the film, that's also a thought I had to learn about it, how to deal with it. You know that your Swedish film industry is very kind, but They didn't say, "Oh yes, Margarethe, you want to do a film? Please take all the material."
Yes, well, I'm not taking any responsibility.
I know.
So, Jan, you watched the film for the first. I'm sure you have seen. He's in the film, of course, but you just saw the film 2 days ago, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think now? I mean, if you don't want to say it in front of Margarethe.
I've already did. I saw it on the worst possible circumstances on my laptop on my flight here. So, so things could have been better. But I was moved to tears from not least the episode you've already talking about with Daniel Bergman. And as you were hinting upon, Ehsan, and also picked up by both Felix and Margarethe, the whole, of course, the aspect of parenthood is crucial in Ingmar Bergman's work. And knowing that this is a project between a parent and her son, and about parenthood, it was really moving in its own right. Then, of course, I think it is a great introduction to the cinema of Ingmar Bergman and the cinema of Margarethe von Trotta, obviously, and so yes, I really liked it.
Now I'm afraid because we have not yet the reaction of Daniel, so
you will have it, I'm sure.
Did you used to watch when Bergman moved to Munich, Margarethe? Did you used to watch films together, going to the cinema?
With him?
Yes.
No, never. No.
Just coming to your flat, holding
your
hands.
And I wanted to add something because you said you chose the scene where he hugs the little boy.
Yeah.
But he was on set. He hugged everybody. He has always to take something in his hands to get more contact to the actors and also the collaborators or so. And Katinka Farago, his script girl, she talked to us and she told us this scene with the hand in the morning, and they went together in a dark room. And for 20 minutes or half an hour, and they just had holding hands all the time, even without speaking. So he needed this connection to get out also for his own strengths, for his own, because he was always anxious. No, he was very much fearing life and fearing. He always thought he was not on top of what he must have been, and I'm like this too. When I'm making a film, I have always to touch something. I have the feeling I can explain myself better to the actors because it passes also through the body and not only because you explain it verbally. So when I did my second film, I did it with Heinz Bennett, who is in Shanghai, who is in The Serpent Egg, one of the main characters. And I touched him, and he said, but you're like Bergman. He's always touching me all the time. So I understood that even this we have in common. So, no, he didn't go with me to the cinema and holding it. But I don't think that he would have liked that. He looked at the films alone in his own. I even don't know if he ever went to a real cinema. When he was in Faro, he had this cinema. You can see it in the end of my film when I'm sitting on these green seats. No, that was his own cinema, and he every afternoon at 3:00 they had a screening of some film he chose, and he got the films from the Swedish Film Institute and they sent the copies to him to look at the films. So he knew practically all the European films which were made in this period, and also ancient older films, but. And so far, he looked only films in his house, or at the television. Then when DVDs were coming, But I don't think that he went to really to, or you know it perhaps better, that he went to a cinema because he was afraid of people. He couldn't stand in middle of a crowd of other people. He was claustrophobic in a way with people, not with rooms.
Yes. Can I add something to that? Because I find it very touching, no pun intended, because, but speaking about the touch of Ingmar Bergman, I'm not referring to his 1971 feature film called The Touch, but the thing you were just talking about, because there is a very, and I'm possibly spoiling Margarethe's film for some of you who haven't seen it yet, but in the sequence which we have already talked about with Daniel Bergman, he speaks about how he and his father in a very emotional, they're both in a very emotional state, and they are trying to hug each other, but the father moves back because, as Daniel says in the film, that he has a hard time, with physical contact with his children, not obviously with his actors. So I find that very moving because it is, of course, I think that, and without going into the psychology of Ingmar Bergman, I wouldn't want to do that, especially not retrospectively. But it's easy enough to understand how Ingmar Bergman needed that kind of, he needed a set, whether a film set or the rehearsal at the stage, for example, in order to feel secure enough to have that kind of physical contact.
Mm-hmm.
In real life, however, even with his own children, he had some difficulties, and so I think you really captured that in your film as well. And I'm repeating myself now, but I don't want, this is less, I think, a matter of psychology than of that of quite a few film directors, I would assume, who need that kind of distance between yourself and reality, and perhaps that is the reason why they became film directors in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And he was afraid of germs, wasn't he? There's this story Jon Donner, Finnish-Swedish filmmaker, tells in his new documentary that he drives for hours to take an American journalist to his place in Faro Island. And Bergman looks at him and says, "You look ill. I'm not going to let you into my house." So he stays outside for 2 hours. The interview is finished, and then he drives back the lady to the port.
He spoke also, sometimes he was very humorous also. He was not only like this. And we saw it together also an interview, a document was an interview where he came with a paper where he noted all his demons. And he listed up, there's a demon for punctuality, it's a demon for insects, and all these demons he had inside himself, no? And one was of illness, that he was afraid of becoming ill, and therefore he didn't let the journalist in the house because he seemed ill, and he also now his daughter, who is the daughter of Elif Ullmann and Bergman. She wrote a wonderful, the Swedish people will know it, Linn Ullmann. She wrote about the last years of Bergman and of her childhood.
It's called The Untouchables.
Yeah, I don't know the title.
The title?
The Worried.
The Worried.
Die Unruhigen, die Beunruhigten.
Yeah.
I read it in German, so I don't know the title nor in. And no, what?
We were talking about the fear of illness and the book by
his demons. But there she speaks about that he couldn't stay. The windows had also to be closed because he was fearing flies and all the insects. They had not to come into the house. So you can imagine how the house was also in a way claustrophobic, because he was always fearing all these insects in summer because they...
So many insects in Sweden.
Yeah.
No, it's
So, he had this, how could you say it? How could you name it? These several...
phobics.
Phobics.
Yeah, I think we could probably fill an entire conference about Ingmar Bergman's phobias, but I just want to remind everybody that he's not the only artist who suffers from, psychiatric ailments, and that's what they were. I don't think we should either romanticize them nor ignore them.
He was accepting it and speaking about it. There are so many artists, they have it, but they never say it.
Right.
And he was so sincere, like also Östlund say it in Ruben, no? That he had the generosity or the capacity to speak about all these phobics, yeah, and to put them in his films, but also to say it, and that is exceptional. Therefore, we have to speak about that.
Can I ask a question about the selection of interviews in the film? It's a very interesting group of people from different generations. All, of course, have associations with Ingmar Bergman. The only one, which was fantastic, and I was so happy to see him in the film, whose links to Bergman were not clear to me, was Carlos Saura, and I was surprised to see him, and the beautiful dogs, of course. How and why you decided to have Carlos in the film?
Carlos Saura.
He once spoke about, long time ago, when he was asked who were the influences for him, for his filmmaking. And he said Buñuel and Bergman. And when you remember his films he did with Chaplin, Geraldine Chaplin, you remember, I think, there is something you can think that he was also a little bit influenced by Bergman. And then my French co-producer, they wanted absolutely, because it's a big name, so you have also to get names in the film. For me, it's not so important, but they wanted me to do that, and we went there, and he was not so fond of speaking about Bergman, and he denied that he was never influenced by Bergman. No, it's only Buñuel, and therefore there's only 4 sentences. It was the only 4 sentences he could tell me about Bergman. All 4 hours, we interviewed him for 4 hours, and he spoke only about himself and about what he was doing and why I didn't a film about him, but why I came to do a film about Bergman. So, but he's an old now also you can accept it, because more you get old, more you want to be still alive and to speak about yourself. I didn't know that before, otherwise I wouldn't have gone there. So now tell us a little bit. You are here to speak about Bergman, not only me.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, I can ask a couple of questions that I have. Or
That would be helpful, yes,
okay.
Thank you.
What about the commercial side of Bergman? He made commercials for television, didn't he? How much of it exists? Can we see it?
They were not for television, but they were before television. They're from 1950, so yeah. I think Bergman would be the first to say that he was constantly working in an industry, and I mean, cinema. Of course, one of the things many of us love cinema is because it is both an art form and an industry, and surely Ingmar Bergman knew this and was very aware that he was working under capitalism and. The films had to make a profit, not least for him to make another movie. So, about the commercials specifically, which he made in 1950, they have been screened here at Cinema Ritrovato before, and they are available on filmarkivet.se, also here in Italy, I think. Yes. and so they are readily available. He made them in 1950 when there was a labor conflict between the film industry and the government. Is a complicated story, actually, but to cut it very short, he was out of a job for a full year, having already some 3 families to provide for. So he made a few commercial films for a soap to sustain a living, more or less. That said, these commercials are beautiful. They are very interesting. But I think that expanding the concept somewhat, I think this commercial aspect of Ingmar Bergman is quite interesting, because he's of course hailed as one of the greatest, art house film directors, but he surely was very keen on having this, if not commercial, then at least this entertaining side to his films, which is evident for those of you who saw re-saw The Seventh Seal yesterday. It is a film which has as many comic reliefs as it has their more famous, less comic scenes then.
I have a question for Margarethe about the women of Ingmar Bergman, the women in films by Ingmar Bergman. Some of them are in your film, interviewed in your film as well. They're very different from the women in your films. And for me, the major difference is being political and apolitical. Very political, politically committed in your films. And almost no sign of politics in the domestic lives of these characters in Bergman films. Still, it seems, in searching for Ingmar Bergman, that you have a certain sympathy for these characters, who are far from the characters that you have depicted in your films.
No, they are not so far away, I think, because my characters are not only political, it's also a wide space also for inside, looking inside and having personal problems, and it's not. And I think Bergman was not apolitical. He was looking at this politics in Sweden, but he didn't want to put it in his films. He decided not to be political in his films. And I'm another generation, and I'm German, so we had another history in our country, no? And we had, when we started to make films, that was after 1968, so we had all this revelation about our past, and that was our package, and we had to deal with it. And so that was normal, that these perspective of the past and of how you deal with the past and what was your way to look to the future and also to the past. So that is such another story from our country side that you can't compare that. But I think he was very aware that the Swedish woman, like also Asayas says it in the film, they were very emancipated already. When you look at Italy or France or so of the same time, the Swedish women were much more advanced in their own, conception of themselves then, no, and also seen from outside.
Shall we take a couple of questions from the audience? Any questions? There's one over there. While the microphone is going that way to reach that gentleman, we also have a clip, a 10-minute long clip of an interview by Ingmar Bergman. And it's very interesting. We don't have to watch it, but if you were interested, we can play it after the session. Because it's an interview which I believe haven't been seen before. It's a BBC interview. I discovered it recently in BBC archives. It was in the middle of a program about the economy of Sweden. So we can watch that if you like after the Q&A.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I wanted to say one of the more interesting things from the documentary yesterday, which I loved, was the fact that Bergman wanted to be considered, or felt that he was in the tradition of either Ibsen and Strindberg as a playwright, and that was something that he wished to have known or be noted for. My question has to do with the fact this is the year of Bergman, and all over the United States they're showing all of his films. Sometimes it's the only thing anybody knows about Sweden is Bergman. My question is, in the work that you have done, what were the influences that created him? He didn't come from a void. What were the influences, whether literary, musical, historical, cultural, that created him? Of course, he was a creative genius, and it was very conflicted, as you pointed out in your documentary. But I'm curious, what tradition might you say he came out of, if there was one?
That's a question for you. Yeah.
Or you, or both. Well, if I can certainly start. I think that there is also, which is evident in your film, there is, I think one key to understanding that is that when Bergman resided in Munich for several years in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he staged as a kind of a showcase for the Scandinavian theater tradition a triple feature with Ibsen's A Doll's House, Strindberg's Miss Julie, and his own Scenes from a Marriage, which is, of course, rather telling of how Bergman placed himself in that tradition, and also rather telling of how confident he was to be, at par with Ibsen and Strindberg, two of the greatest, dramatists in the history of 19th century theatre. And so, of course, Ibsen's and Strindberg's influence on Bergman cannot possibly be overestimated, though, of course, there are many others as well, a few of them who are probably more known in Sweden than in other countries, such as his namesake Hjalmar Bergman, no relation, and another writer with deep influence on Ingmar Bergman, and Per Lagerkvist, who, though he is a Nobel laureate, is probably still more known in Sweden than abroad. Of course, I think the influence on Ingmar Bergman's career, of course, takes it's basically starts from the post-war period and onwards, and as such, it has as much or almost as much connected to the trauma of the World War than as so many other films from the mid-40s and onwards. So it's hard to, of course, to extrapolate all the major influences on Ingmar Bergman, but surely there are tons of them, and I think that Ingmar Bergman is one of those directors or one of those artists who sometimes are perhaps we tend to look upon them as you suggested. As they existed in a vacuum, as if they were isolated monoliths, whereas the truth of the matter is, of course, that they are heavily relying on well, not least influences from the past, such as Ibsen and Strindberg, but also, and certainly in the case of Ingmar Bergman, how he was constantly, throughout his career, paying attention to what was happening. So, I mean, for his films that he made in Germany, for instance, I mean, The Serpent's Egg, it is clear to see how this is a sort of a response to Cabaret, coming a few years earlier, and From the Life of the Marionettes look sometimes more like Fassbinder than Ingmar Bergman, and so on and so forth. And there are so many of those influences that we could, after we've done the conference on Ingmar Bergman's phobias, we can go into that, perhaps.
Any more questions? There's one at the back.
Thanks so much. The film is just marvelous. I've only seen it once, but hope to see it again soon. And the question, I wanted to follow up a little bit on where you started, which was this discussion of how the film got to be made now. And really the question I want to put is why now, or what significance you see in making this film now? How is it significant given the moment we're at in the history of cinema?
I don't know. The significance, for me, it was the occasion to go into his films again, because I say it in the film that for me it was the influence in the 60s, and I went on to see his films, but that was input for me to become a filmmaker. But now doing this film, I had to go back to all his films and to make a sort of voyage, like I did it then in the film, but a voyage in myself. What was it for my life? Was he really accompanying me until nowadays? Because to make a film in my age about somebody you got the input when you were very young, is there still a line that is in a sort, is it still your in a way your father or not? And I had the feeling he is still my father, and that was for me more or less not so, it was, not a positive way, that I'm still dependent from a father, which I didn't have in my own life because he was never there. So, but that is a sort of secret I have not to tell you, but it's like that. And so therefore, in the end, the image in the end was this big rock, and where I'm standing like this, and the rock is so that's my feeling still now. And I am a little bit afraid that I didn't become more self-confident with myself, that I'm still, and that I think it's also because I'm a woman. We would never learn to be like this, no? We are still under the shadow of all our male colleagues in the cinema.
The gentleman in the middle.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about Summer with Monica. Next month, at the Motion Picture Academy in Los Angeles, we're going to show, in celebration of the centennial, a new print from the Swedish Film Institute of Summer with Monica. And when I was doing research, I read that Bergman said it's one of the few films of his that he loved to see over and over again, that it had a special place for him. And, it exists in its own space, I think, between, the early films and the war films and the films of the 50s and 60s. It's kind of a freestanding film, and I wonder if any of you had any thoughts, any insights why Bergman would have, cited this film as one of his favorites.
Well, first of all, when it comes to Ingmar Bergman's favorites among his own films, he changed his mind all the time. So you don't depends on where and when you got that quote. But surely, this afternoon, the film he hated the most of his own is Screen Here. So we'll be coming back to that issue in a few hours. But I do agree with you. I've heard that also, how Bergman has spoken fondly about Summer with Monica. Surely it is one of his most. It was one of the films that launched his career. And it is also the film in which he met Harriet Anderson, with whom he became romantically involved for several years, and who, of course, stars in many of his films. It is also, I think, it is in a way the epitome of Scandinavian cinema of the 1950s and early 60s, which are, of course, also associated with the notion of the Swedish sin, which is something else that you couldn't possibly overrate in the success of Ingmar Bergman, and he was one of the first to acknowledge that. He actually, for a leaflet for the I think the French distribution of Summer with Monica, he wrote a fake interview with himself. Ingmar Bergman often did that, and in that interview he said that skinny dipping should be mandatory in all Swedish films, because, or at least they should have contained some nudity, because these things sell films. Of course, Bergman is very keen on downplaying the artistic side of his films. I think he genuinely felt more, or that he really did associate himself with the gestures of the Seventh Seal rather than with high art, and as such he felt all kinds of when needed you should use every possible tool you would have in your box, and nudity being one of them. That said, though, I know I have spoken to many people from around the world who have witnessed, people who would now be in their 80s, who have witnessed how when they first saw films like, for instance, Summer with Monica in the early 50s, how these films, rather than just being erotically suggestive, how they could also function as rather political films, in the sense that they showed that another world is possible, that there are indeed, in cultures where with heavy censorship, in dictatorships, and where these films came as a message from a world which were considered to be more free in a way. This is something that could be, of course, also problematized, but still, I think all those aspects would perhaps, in a way, sum up why Bergman himself felt so fond of Summer with Monica.
Margarethe, do you want to add something? Do you have any thoughts on Summer with Monica?
Yeah, but I felt this freedom, which we had not when we were young, in Germany, for instance, no? And that was when I saw it the first time, or I was already over this period. But this being free with sex also, but with themselves, with the nature, and I think it's very special also for Sweden, because you have a long winter, and not so much light, and then comes the summer, and there all of a sudden you have the whole night and the whole day, and that must create something so enjoyable and so free, and all of a sudden you have all this light, and you have the nature around you, and so you feel in another way than we do it perhaps in other countries, and that was for me also a side. I said, yes, but they have that. And in a way, he always feared the light. And when he did his cauchemars, how do you say, his nightmares, he did it also in a very, very light, no? Because he liked more perhaps the rain and the grey and for his own films. But that was a moment where he also felt this summer freeness together with Harriet Anderson, and she was very young, and she had it. I think she gave him a lot also of her own freedom.
Any more questions? Okay. So how about, is it a good idea to watch the clip? So this I don't know when this was filmed, but this was broadcast on Panorama program on BBC One on 21st of May 1962, not 61, 62. And I think it hasn't been used ever since because it was on film, so we just recently digitized it. The quality is not good. And as I said, it's a program about the economy in Sweden. It starts with a clip from Seven Seal, so Dark Ages, and uses the BBC presenter, a very uptight gentleman, uses that as a metaphor for the transition of Sweden from Dark Ages, from poverty to prosperity of 20th century, and how it led to people like Bergman to nourish, to become international celebrities. And it's a funny one because it shows that Bergman is again in control of the situation. He has asked the BBC guy, it's very unusual in the 60s program, they're always properly dressed and very uptight, has asked him to lie down on the grass like this and interview him, and he's having a good time. The guy, the interviewer, doesn't, and they talk about Sweden. So you just see the interview part, not the clip from the Seven Seal, and not the funny conclusion that the BBC interviewer makes. Thank you so much, Margarethe, Johan, and Felix.